Today I want to talk about the Form 3520A and specifically the filing procedures associated with it. This has caused a lot of problems over the last few years because there's a lot of uncertainty as to what requires a Form 3520A and then how do you actually file the thing after you do it. The IRS seems to be unclear. Taxpayers are definitely unclear. Penalty notices are going out. It's been a huge mess. So I want to try and clarify this. I'm not going to do it all over a 10-minute video, but this one will kind of set the stage, and then I hope to do some more that are going to be a little more detailed into the different aspects of the Form 3520A. So what we're going to talk about is generally what is the Form 3520A, who has to file it, when do they have to file it, and the specific reporting procedure options that we have. And then we'll talk about some specific situations that I've seen over the last few years. So in general, the Form 3520A is required to be filed where you have a U.S. owner of a foreign grantor trust. So a foreign grantor trust is a big topic with a lot of little definitions associated with it. But in general, there's two different types that we're going to talk about. One is actual trust. So if you set up, say, a family trust outside the U.S. and that trust, the person, it has a U.S. owner that took assets. So if I own real estate and I put it into a UK family trust, and I retain certain powers over that trust or asset, so I can take distributions whenever I want. I can just cancel the trust and take the assets back whenever I want. That's definitionally a revocable trust, which would create a grantor trust. So the impact of that is that the IRS will require the Form 3520A, and it looks at it kind of like a look-through, like a disregarded entity, and that any income associated with that trust will come back to and flows directly to the grantor. So in my example, that would be me. I'd pick up any income. So for example, if that property I put into the trust had rental income, I would pick that rental income up on my personal tax return, regardless of whether there's any distributions. The other type of foreign grantor trust, and this is the one that causes the most problems with expats in particular, is foreign retirement plans. So a lot of people don't think of a retirement plan as a trust, but in most scenarios, that's what it is. I mean, in particular in the U.S., a 401k is a trust arrangement. It just has a very specific code section associated with it into how it's taxed. So foreign retirement plans are very similar, and they can create foreign grantor trust relationships. Now, I'm going to have separate videos that go into a lot more detail as to looking at specific foreign retirement plans and whether or not that creates a foreign grantor trust. But today we're just going to look at the ones more broadly. Let's say that this foreign retirement plan does create a foreign grantor trust. And a lot of times it's uncertain. So people are just filing these forms to be conservative, which makes sense. But if you don't file it correctly, that's when these big penalties come in. And the penalty is the greater of 5% of the value of the trust or $10,000. So if you file this Form 3520A late, or you don't file it at all, the minimum penalty is $10,000, or it could be 5% of the value. And the bad thing about this penalty is that it is automatic. So if you file a late 3520A past the due date, and we're going to talk a lot about due dates here in a second, but there's no the IRS is going to send you a automatic penalty that says what you owe and are assessed by the IRS. There's no audit lottery that you can play here to see if you get a penalty. They're automatically going to send you the notice. So that's broadly who has to file the Form 3520A and the penalty that you're up against if you do it incorrectly or don't do it at all or do it late. So the due date is generally going to be the 15th day of the third month. So if you have a calendar year taxpayer, then it's going to be March 15th, and then you can extend it on Form 7004 to September 15th. So, I mean, you think about it just like a U.S. trust or a U.S. business. It has a March 15th due date. You file the 7004 to extend it to September 15th. And the 3520A is filed separately from the 1040. You can't e-file it, so it has to be mailed in. Now, the tricky part and the main part of this topic is that there's really two different filing procedures depending on who's filing it. So the general rule is that the filing obligation falls on the actual trust itself. So in my examples, the family trust that I set up, that trust has the filing requirement to file by the third month of the 15th day of the third month, so March 15th. Just like a U.S. trust, it's the trust that has the filing requirement. If you think about a foreign retirement plan, so think about a Australian superannuation fund that's, let's say Mercer is the financial institution. Technically, they have the Form 3520A filing requirement. Now, practically, there's no way that Mercer is going to be filing a U.S. tax form for this Form 3520A. They've never heard of that, and they're not going to do it. So your other option is to do what's called filing a substitute filing requirement, which basically says the foreign trust didn't file it, so the responsibility falls on the U.S. grantor, the U.S. owner, to file that form. So once you file under these substitute procedures, the due dates change. Now it gets attached to your U.S. personal tax return filing due date. So it has an April 15th due date, and the extension to October 15th actually attaches to the U.S. tax return extension. So you don't have to file a separate extension for the Form 3520A in that case. It still has to be filed separately and mailed to the IRS. It's not included with your personal tax return, but it is attached to the due date. And really the way it's done is there's a separate Form 3520 that has to be filed for an owner or a beneficiary of a foreign trust. And that attaches to the U.S. individual tax return filers, U.S. tax return, the 1040, at least the due dates. And so on the substitute filing procedures, the Form 3520A has to be attached to the Form 3520, and they're all mailed in together by the due date of the individual's tax return. So April 15th or extended to October 15th. And that's a huge misconception, or that's the tricky part of this, because a lot of times I had people that came to me October 1st and said, I forgot to file my 3520 by September 15th. And the answer is they didn't need to file by September 15th. They can file under the substitute filing procedures, which would have been extended to October 15th under their personal tax return extension. Attach it to the Form 3520, and it gets mailed to the IRS. So these are the substitute filing procedures. And what caused a big problem in the prior years is that although that is the rule, the IRS seemed to misunderstand their own rule. So people were getting penalty notices that were filing under these substitute filing procedures. So let's say if you filed this on October 1st, under the substitute filing procedures, the IRS was still sending notices to people because they missed the September 15th deadline, even though that wasn't the deadline that applied. Now they've cleaned this up, and I haven't been seeing those automatic penalties anymore if you check the right boxes on the 3520A and the 3520. But it was a problem in the past, and it's just something you need to make sure procedurally you're checking the right boxes just to avoid those notices. And specifically on the 3520A, I have two screenshots here to just show an example. So the bottom one is the Form 3520A, and at the top of that form, there's actually a checkbox that says Substitute Form 3520A. You have to check that box so that the IRS knows that it's going to be attached to the due dates of the personal tax return, and that way they won't send you a notice for missing the September 15th or March 15th due date. The other thing is on the Form 3520, and we're not talking specifically about that form, but they go together in that when you file a substitute, it gets attached to the 3520. On that form, it has a question that said, did the foreign trust file Form 3520A for the current year? So another way to say it, in my example, did Mercer file a Form 3520A? The answer is basically always going to be no. And in which case you check no, and that tells the IRS to be on the lookout for a 3520A that's attached. And then you're under the individual return due dates. Some other considerations just to think about. So my example was Australia. You have to be a little careful with the fiscal years. So Australia, for example, has a June 30 year end. So these superannuation funds, and again, I'm going to have a separate video on whether these are actually trusts or not. But assuming that it is a foreign grantor trust, it's going to have a June 30 year end. So you have to be a little careful with the way you file it, because that June 30 year end, so the technical rule is it's 3 months and 15 days from the year end of the trust. So that would make it June, July, August, September 15th would be the due date. And then you could extend under your personal return extension for another 6 months. So now you have this weird mismatch of years. So you just need to make sure you're doing that correctly and tracking the due date so you don't miss that due date. And another thing to just remember is that when you have these foreign grantor trusts, the filing requirement's important, but you also have to pick up the income that goes through it. Now, it kind of depends on what, if you're looking at a certain type of retirement account, we have to apply the tax treaties for a particular jurisdiction to make sure that, we're filing these things correctly. But as a general rule, if you have a foreign grantor trust, you have to look through to the assets of the trust. So that can trigger FBAR requirements, Form 8621 with PFIX if they invest in foreign mutual funds, Form 8938. So, you just have to be aware of the other reporting requirements that could come as a result of this foreign grantor trust. And then there's the Form 8833 with respect to taking certain treaty provisions. But again, this is just a broad overview of how the Form 3520A needs to be filed, who has to file it, the filing procedures associated with it. And really, I just wanted to break down how that substitute filing requirement actually works, and that in most cases, that's what we should be filing, because it's very rare. Actually, I've never seen it to where the foreign trust is actually filing a Form 3520A. No, it's always the grantor, the U.S. person. The foreign person isn't even going to know about this responsibility, and they're not going to do it. It's the U.S. grantor that has this filing requirement, and you need to check that substitute box so that the IRS is aware of the due date they should be applying. More videos to come on this. Thanks for watching.